In three, two, one.
Dr. Kaiser, you're a humble man introducing yourself without the doctor. We don't get that too often, um, but we really appreciate you being here. I wanted to start off a little hot and a little um, pointed to our listeners. I'd say the vast majority are in the Midwest. If you were designing a grazing system and you had 160 acres, let's say, for cattle, or designing a grazing system, you can put whatever you want on that land. How are you setting this up? How are you designing it?
If I'm in the Midwest, I'm going to use that assumption, Nicholas. So I'm going to
Yes,
assume I'm
sir.
north of the fescue belt. And so I'm going to think in terms of a mix of cool and warm season perennial pastures. I like annuals. They have a role. They're good for wildlife. That they're not. That's not a bad thing. But from just a straight up economic standpoint and a labor standpoint and a time standpoint, any kind of forage system ought to be built on the back of perennials. And so at
Mm.
y'all's latitude in Iowa, I'll use that as an example. Maybe I'll use the Iowa Missouri line. That cool season pasture could be an introduced species like fescue or brome. And from my experience in North Missouri, it would be probably some of each, maybe some orchard grass thrown in. Uh, and then the balance would be a perennial warm season pasture. And depending on some of your objectives, that could be a multi-species blend built around blue stem and Indian grass. That would be a great forage resource. I'm actually kind of fond of switchgrass, and a lot of people kind of shrink back when you talk about switchgrass because it can kind of be big and ugly. But switchgrass is a very resilient grass with a very high carrying capacity, and in a grazing system, it can take a little more abuse than blue stem. And let's face it, I don't care how good a manager you are. Sooner or later, you're going to cut a corner, make a mistake, and something's going to get a little banged up. So switchgrass has a place, and particularly if you've got some damper spots in that 160 acres. Back
Mm.
on the cool seasons, we have some. The only cool seasons I'm aware of that are very productive, that there's good seed source for, are rye, Canada, Virginia, and for y'all, probably not southern, but anyway, the wild rye, and they're very productive. I don't have a lot of experience with them, but if you wanted to make that entire system native, that could be your cool system component or cool season component. The difficulty with wild rice, as I understand it, is that they don't necessarily last a long time. And I think that may be in part due to management, but also, you think about things like side oats, which are a little earlier successional species. And side oats, you don't really expect them to persist in the stand long term. Whereas blue stem is a climax species and you expect it to be there sort of in perpetuity. But if you really wanted to avoid the introduced species, I would go with the wild rise. The one question I haven't answered is the ratio. And so, in my mind, if you look at existing forage systems and you take me down to the Gulf Coast states, it's basically 100% perennial warm seasons. If you take me, and I've not looked at any pastures in the state of Minnesota, but my assumption is they're about 100% cool season, at least if you go far enough north in Minnesota,
Hmm.
central Wisconsin maybe as well. And so as you move up that latitudinal gradient, there's a trend towards more and more cool season, or if you're heading south, more and more warm season. In North Missouri, one of the interesting things in southern Iowa, one of the interesting things, if you look at it historically, that was a system that was about 95 plus percent perennial warm season grasses. And
Mm.
so much of eastern North America, up to shockingly high latitudes, was dominated by perennial warm seasons. And so, if I was going to do that there, what one thought would be to go maybe a 50-50. The further north you go, you might want to lean a little more on the cool seasons. But then again, there's also how you choose to manage, right? And so, Nicholas, that may be a whole lot more answer than you were looking for, but
No,
It's
that was
great.
awesome.
that's the kind of things I would think about.
Well, what about, I get this question a lot, and I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any experience with it. Hey, I've got this cool season pasture. I really don't want to rip it up. A lot of them, I don't want to spray. Can I just introduce natives into it? And I guess before I get my thoughts, I'd love to hear
No.
yours. Why?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. Our perennial cool seasons that are out there, even if it's a very ratty pasture that's been beat up, those perennial cool seasons are, and I'm a lot more familiar with fescue than I am smooth brome, but I know y'all got a lot of brome up in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can tell you is they are very tenacious species, non-native, so they have some competitive advantages that are typical of introduced species, especially aggressive introduced species. And it's not going to work. You're wasting seed. If you're not willing to do something, either chemicals or tillage, save your money. That's the cost of doing business. The competition is just too strong for a small seedling to deal with a thick perennial grass, or even a again, a beat up pasture that's fairly thin. I would not do it.
Well, then here's another question. I've heard it recommended that you put Timothy or and/or orchard grass with your natives because they're more clumpy. They don't kind of like fescue or brome can kind of create this sod. What do you think of doing that if they're okay with putting some non-natives in there?
Well, my objection to doing that wouldn't be based on the fact that it's non-native. We often put some non-natives out there, and let's face it, our farms and our hunting properties are covered with non-natives in many respects. But I still would not do it. And here's another reason why I would be hesitant to do that. One, I'm not sure what it's gaining you. Number one, I think the logic is sort of a longer grazing season, maybe. But if you're going to go to the trouble in a cool season dominated farm system, which is what most of us have, really almost down into central Alabama, and you're going to go to the trouble to establish a warm season perennial, you're spending money, you're spending time, and there's always risk. I don't care what you're planting. Cereal rye has risk to it. Much easier to establish, but any planting project has risk. And with small seeded natives, which haven't been through any plant breeding to enhance germination or early seedling vigor, the risk is a little bit higher. So why go to all that trouble to create a warm season pasture that then is going to be compromised in terms of its productivity and its management at some level by having a cool season component there? So if I'm going to go to the trouble, I'm going to have me a warm season pasture and I'm going to have a cool season pasture.
Totally separate.
Yeah, that's how I would approach it. And if you think about grazing management, if you have the right kind of spring where the cool season species are really prospering, so you get some early warm temperatures, but not too warm for the cool season species, and you get a lot of rainfall. In other words, one of those springs where, say, orchard grass can just really be productive. Well, wherever it's being productive, it is creating competition for the warm seasons, and the warm season productivity is going to be slowed down at least for that season. But that can turn into a snowball effect. And so in the long run, I think when you're trying to manage a pasture that has a substantial perennial cool season and perennial warm season component, I don't know if you ever did this when you were a kid, but you're playing in the pool and you got one of those big beach balls and you try to sit on it, you can't do it. And to me, trying to manage a warm season, cool season, perennial pasture mixed together, it's a little bit like that. It's going to tend to run one way or run the other. And again, if you're making the investment for warm seasons, my presumption is a typical Iowa farm or Illinois farm where there's cattle has a lot of cool season grass already. And so if it runs in the direction of cool season in that mixed pasture, what have you accomplished other than spending a lot of money? At least that's how I look at it.
Yeah, okay, that is really helpful. Now, I've got to clarify something. Earlier, when you said what percentage do you want to be your cool season, and you were saying that the wild rye are good options, which I've also heard that Arctic or prairie brome, which is a native, is a good option. So you put those in there.
Okay.
You wouldn't put them with your big blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass. You would put them in a totally separate lot. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
To a large extent, yes. Because they're both native, they would probably play better together. And here in our latitudes, we have done very little work with the cool season perennial natives. And the reason for that is that the wild rye break dormancy and begin to be productive relatively late in the spring. So I can get on orchard grass and fescue earlier than I can on wild rye. Maybe not by much, but a little bit. And really, our warm season natives don't break dormancy that much later than our cool season perennials. In other words, there's about a month at our latitude, maybe 6 weeks, where I have fescue but not natives. And wild rye, all they really do is give me about another 4 weeks in that window where I've already covered up with cool season perennials, right? I mean, I'm ate up with fescue and orchard grass, and I guess those are the main ones, some bluegrass. So they're really not adding that many grazing days to my calendar, and they're doing so at an expense. So really, for me, it's not that big an advantage. At y'all's latitude, it may be that you could gain a little more advantage, but because they're natives, I think I would definitely try mixing those together, whereas I would not do that with non-natives. I wouldn't put the orchard grass, timothy, brome, fescue in there at all. The wild rye and you mentioned the prairie brome, I'd definitely be interested in trying that, and that's some experience that, again, at our latitude, we just don't have.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Here's a question I have for you along these lines, Dr. Kaiser. I think I heard once from another prairie media channel that one of the things I used to marvel at driving across Iowa was like, man, the early settlers here, the people, the homesteaders, the people setting up these pastures. One of the modern wonders of the world could be the fact that they were able to plant brome on every square inch of of the Midwest. And I later heard that, well, the main reason we have so much brome and other cool season non-native grasses is because of the intensive grazing that took place. Just cattle weren't rotated enough, and they eliminated the native warm season grasses, but the things like brome and Kentucky blue and fescue, those things could persist because they had, they're just more durable, I guess, to the heavy grazing. And from your research, have you found that to be true? That this could obviously still play out today if someone is going back to we'll say square one, and they're using a chemical burn down, maybe some tillage mixed in as well, but trying to go back to a blank slate and reestablish a pasture. If they are not careful enough and they aren't rotating their animals with the correct frequency, will it? I suppose it would happen again if it's true that we got all this brome takeover because of overgrazing.
Yeah, so native grasses, one thing to keep in mind we refer to them as tall grasses. They're tall growing, and y'all have seen mature big blue stem or Indian grass or switchgrass and how big it can get. And in these plants, there's this structure that we refer to it as a growing point, and that growing point in native grasses is elevated above the ground. So I don't know if y'all are very familiar with Bermuda grass. It probably doesn't grow a lot in Iowa, but the further south you go, the more
grows in around people's patios.
Yeah.
But its structures are such that the entire plant is really close to the ground. But you think about natives being an erect growing species, and that growing point being up off the ground, it's easy to defoliate them completely, number one. Number two, it's easy to take that growing point out, which slows that grass's growth down even more. And so for those structural reasons, and there's one other big reason, and I'll just give you an example. We've got plenty of pastures that we've established for our projects, and our establishment is never perfect. We don't get 100% stand ever, but in some of the gaps in those stands, other things come in. And that's nature's way, right? We got long growing seasons down here, plenty of rainfall usually. And one of the things that often will come in is some Bermuda grass. And what I've always observed is cattle will walk across that Bermuda grass to get to the next bite of blue stem Indian grass native. And
Interesting.
I can go into a blue stem pasture and I cannot find a bite on a patch of Bermuda grass. They completely ignore it. So in range science world, we refer to these as increasers and decreasers, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with that terminology, but for your listeners, an increaser is something that in heavy grazing pressure becomes more abundant in a pasture. It's basically a one-to-one correlation with things cattle would rather not eat. Whereas a decreaser is the opposite. It's something that as soon as they get turned into the pasture, the first thing they go after is that species. And they will preferentially graze it to the point that it begins to disappear from the stand. And so, what range scientists have done for years is walk into a pasture and look for certain species. And if they see a particular species, they know the place has been overgrazed. So back to your question, absolutely with native grasses, you have to be a little more intentional in your grazing management. And people often talk about rest, and rest is very important for grasses, but I'm going to go all heretical here. That I really don't care about rest when it comes to native grasses, and some of your folks that are trained in forages and range science, probably their heads blowing up right now. But what I'm going to tell you is it's all about leaf surface area, right? And so I could graze a native grass pasture and all season long never give it a day's rest. Cattle are out there every single day. The reason I can get away with that is I've stocked it such that I'm always leaving enough leaf surface area out there to keep those plants vigorous and productive and feeding themselves and not just the cattle. On the other hand, if I'm going to graze it really aggressively and really knock it down, I have to give it rest. And here's a fun little study from the 1950s. A guy named John Kreider did this study. And what he did is he defoliated a bunch of plants and monitored their root development in the face of that defoliation. And basically what he found out is as long as you don't remove more than 50% of the leaf surface area, the root growth never changes. It never slows down. So the point is, and y'all have heard the adage, take half, leave half. We can never really do that very precisely, and I'm sure any given year and season it's not perfect science. But the point is, if you're leaving lots of leaf surface area out there, that plant's going to stay just as vigorous as it pleases, and you can do that for decades. On the other hand, if you graze it really close, you either have to give it rest or you're going to see it disappear. So if you take a blue stem pasture and you graze it as if it was orchard grass, for example, and graze it down to 3-4 inch canopy all season long, I promise you will get rid of that blue stem. It may take a couple seasons to do it, but you will get rid of it. On the other hand, if you maintain and your wildlife friends will really love this, but in our research, if I maintain a, say, 15 to 18 inch canopy on that native grass sward, I can graze it much of the season at that height. That may be a little on the low side. Maybe I need to be closer to 20 inches, but I can leave the cattle out there as long as my stocking rate lets me do that. And that taller canopy, those grasses can put up with all summer. And then number two, what we find is that canopy height is really good for things like our quail and our grassland birds, which are all, their populations are crashing right and left. So that's an option. But back to your point is it's about leaf surface area. And if you don't respect that, then you need to start looking at rest.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was
that brings up some important considerations too, Nicholas. I don't know if you were thinking of this as well, but even in just mowing guidelines for a new prairie planting, you want to be careful not to be cutting good stuff off below that growth point, and possibly either really setting that plant back or maybe even killing it completely if it's a young enough plant. And so I want to do some more personal research into that, just on that growth point height and what's best practice. Do you have a good general length to leave natives at for mowing, Dr.
Yeah,
Kaiser?
absolutely. We always recommend an 8-inch mowing height. And a lot of people look at me funny when I say that and say, hey, my mower doesn't cut that high. Well, they're wrong. It does cut that high. And we've got a publication at our website here at UT, our Center for Native Grasslands. We've got scads of publications in there, but one of them specifically addresses mowing height. And there's about a half dozen different tricks in there you can use depending on what kind of mower configuration you have to raise that mower up. And I will say this too, native grasses, well, I just explained to you why they're vulnerable to overgrazing. The flip side of that is they're really pretty darn resilient. You can graze native grasses into the dirt if you want to. The problem is that you cannot continue to do that, right? So let's say you go out there in the spring of the year and you turn loose a bunch of cattle into a native grass pasture, and you get busy, or you decide to go to the beach and forget that you left the gate open, or whatever situation you want to create in your mind there. And you come back 3 weeks later and it's nubbed down to the dirt. It's not time to cry. That's where this rest thing comes in. You pull the animals out of there and you give it rest. So abusive grazing, one off, these grasses will recover from. They need a longer rest period, but they'll recover. Same thing with mowing. 8 inches is much better, because at 8 inches you're going to generally always be above the growing point. And another key thing with native grasses, they make exceptionally good hay. Even switchgrass, which I've heard a lot of people cuss as a hay crop, but the people who cuss it as a hay crop generally have cut it when they see seed heads. People who say, man, that's a really good hay, have generally cut it when it's still very vegetative. So the earlier in the year you look at that plant, the lower that growing point is. So an 8-inch cutting height and of course I got to think about your growing season is different than ours. But if that switchgrass is hip high, let's say, and you don't see a single seed head anywhere, we're probably in the early boot stage at that point, okay, just to use a term that a lot of hay farmers might recognize. But if we're in the early boot stage and we cut that, we might be able to get away with a 4-inch cutting and not take out it might be a little low, but we might not take out the growing point. The later I wait, the higher that growing point, the greater the recovery time that grass has to have. And so with that growing point, if it's removed, what you have to recognize is you've probably removed almost all the leaf surface area. So now I've got a plant that has no leaves to conduct photosynthesis. It can't create any carbohydrates for itself. So what does it do? Well, it goes to the savings account, right? The roots. And it grabs what it needs to first, before it can even put a leaf out, it needs a new growing point. And then it can start to put leaves out. Well, some research at University of Nebraska by Bruce Anderson and his colleagues a few years back demonstrated that there's about I've forgotten now, I'll lie to you either way I go, but about a 4 to 6 week recovery cycle. Now that doesn't mean it's not growing at all during there, but before it catches back up, and that's based on the root reserves. And so you're really setting yourself back every time you do that. Now you mentioned young plants in that question, and we never recommend taking a hay harvest in the seedling year. We want that plant to be able to drive all that energy and all that growth into what we hope will ultimately be in y'all's part of the world, 6, 8, maybe 10-foot deep root systems. If we got some shallow soil somewhere here in a place like Tennessee, maybe we only got 4 feet of soil. But the point is, we want those deep roots to be able to fully develop. And so during that seedling year, we try to avoid defoliation. But once it's a second year plant, it's going to be able to withstand that defoliation. But again, in those guidelines, that 8-inch cutting height that we talk about.
Yeah.
That's really good information.
What about, yeah, thank you. What about native forbs? Do you see they have a role to play? Now, something I will add is that we have a straight big blue stem field so that we can harvest it, we get seed off of it. We've had one since about the time that I was born, and right now it doesn't produce any seed. We basically still have it because we haven't had a chance to rip it up yet. It is in the field. Not only does it not produce seed, because I know big blue stem can do that after a while, it is yellow as could be. So it needs either fertilizer or it needs to be ripped up, needs some nitrogen, something. And so that's one aspect. Are the forbs going to help keep this to be a healthier thing? But then also, the manure that's dropped on there I feel like would have something to do. I'm speaking out of my wheelhouse. So I'm just adding some points to what are your thoughts on the forbs, and if you know anything about the nutrition that they add to the grazers?
Yeah, we've just wrapped up a bunch of studies looking at putting native forbs into native grass pastures, and I think it's a great idea. There's a couple considerations. So what we did is some of those forbs can be very expensive, and y'all as seed producers understand you're not trying to charge
Hmm.
somebody extra. It's that you got a field that produces 40 pounds of seed per acre. I don't know if that's the right number for any of the forbs, but the point is they
That's
don't
pretty
want
good.
to,
That's a pretty good guess.
Yeah, and sometimes
and
that's way
some of
more.
them, well, maybe they don't. That's a good year, and they don't
Yeah.
necessarily produce every year. You know, there's some variability, and so by the time you put the time and effort into combine and cleaning, you can't sell that seed for $2 a pound. That's not even an option
Right.
unless you're a charity business, right? But
Right.
what we
Yep.
did is we kind of screened forbs for what recommendations were out there for wildlife and pastures. So we looked at all different folks that were advocating for particular forbs, and we looked at what were less expensive, and we also looked at what we thought were imazapic tolerant. So we had sort of an advantage to control non-native species and get these
Hmm.
native species established. Anyway, we've thrown
That's plateau, right? Plateau
Plateau is
herbicide.
a common
Yep.
trade name
Yep.
for it. That's correct. It's also sold as panoramic. I don't know if there's anybody else now selling it, but it's off patent, so it's become relatively cheap. Uh, but anyway, so we looked at that. We've put as many as 20 different forb species out there. And what I will tell you, there's a number of them, at least in our environment, we've had very little success in getting them established in a pasture setting. Now, again, so Illinois bundleflower comes to mind. I love that plant.
Hmm.
It's a good forage. We've played around with it, putting it in pastures. It just doesn't take in our environment. Now, maybe it does really well in Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, what have you. But there's about 6 or 8 species that we have seen consistent, reliable establishment, number one. And number two, good persistence in a pasture setting, right? So if we can plant it, we get a great stand, and it's gone the next year. That's a pretty good little investment for a farmer to have it disappear so quickly. And the third criteria we're really concerned about is, does it become a pest, right? So one of the things we put out there, because there's a lot of recommendations around it, and I'm not against the idea at all, but is Maximilian sunflower. Beautiful
Hmm.
plant, productive, a lot of volume, and cattle graze it, but it can get pretty woolly. And most farmers I know, if they see a 8 foot tall Maximilian sunflower in their pasture, they're going to start to get concerned. So
Yeah.
on the one end, we want it to persist. On the other end, we don't want it to become what is perceived as a pest.
Hmm.
And we also want to know that cattle are benefiting from them and grazing them. So I may not be able to tick off that whole list for you, but there's about a half dozen or so species that I think make perfect sense in a pasture. We also went to the trouble to harvest a bunch of those and send it off to a wet chemistry lab, because the NIRS at this point hasn't caught up to forb nutrition, right? We can't use NIRS. We need a better data set yet. Anyway, we sent them off to wet chemistry, and what we wound up seeing is that relative to grasses, they have very low fibers, right? And that sort of makes sense. So very, very good digestibility, very good intake, consumption based on NDF. And the crude protein, the way we ended up doing this is we had very small sample sizes for the wet chemistry lab, and we wound up having to take harvests from all through the summer, which we did on purpose, periodically harvesting, and lump them together. So we had stuff that was senesced, almost brown. We had
Hmm.
stuff that was very vegetative and all points in between, and just lumped it all together. And yet we still got, and again, I can't remember the exact figures. It's in a publication that's out there right now. I could direct you all to. But our crude protein levels, as I recall, were sort of 15 to 20%, in some cases higher. And of course, cattle are selective grazers, right? They're not necessarily going to go graze something brown when something green and tender is right
Sure.
next to them. So I think the effective crude protein rate is probably going to be in the mid 20s of what they're eating.
Is
So the
that
point
good?
is, they're good. Yeah, that's very good. That's
Okay.
exceptional. That's alfalfa.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And so, we've got these good protein levels. We have low fiber levels, which means good digestibility and good energy. So they're perfectly good forages. And what we saw, and it really depends on the management of your pasture, but if you have an appropriate stocking rate, and we can talk about that a little bit too, cattle are going to readily graze most of these species. And interestingly enough, it's a one-off study, but it was a sound study. I mean, it had replication. It was good research. But I usually don't go to the bank off of a single research project, right? I usually like seeing accumulation of several studies to kind of begin to feel real confident about those results. But I do know in that one study, we actually saw a modest advantage in rate of gain on our cattle where we had enriched the pasture with a whole fistful of native forbs relative to those that were just straight grass.
Wow.
If I pencil whipped it though, which we'll try to do at some point, my concern is that the cost of that forb seed and the effort to put it in, if I go to my ag economist, they're going to make me put the cost of running that drill across the field, right? And drill rental, and they don't let me get away with anything. They know where the costs are. So and they charge me for my labor, so to speak, right? It's just typical economic analysis that ag economists do. But if I combine those inputs, seed costs and the others, I wind up that modest rate of gain that I've picked up, better animal performance, probably doesn't pencil out. But if you've got other goals and objectives, you like the beauty of it, you want to help pollinators, you want to help wildlife, all these other things that maybe aren't directly putting a paycheck in your pocket. The point is this, is you can do it and not hurt yourself in terms of animal performance. And that's, I think, an important finding.
Well, and something I want to add real quick is that here, and that makes total sense. I'm not sure what forbs you're speaking of, but if there's some of them that, and I want to get into that, but if there's some of them that I'm thinking of, I know firsthand because we actually move quite a bit of seed in the Southeast, and a lot of times I'll go through other seed producers because I like to keep it closer to, and so we'll help get them in contact, or we'll help get them the right mix and then get it from a seed producer closer to them. Seed producers in the Southeast are extremely limited compared to the Midwest, and that's nothing against them. They're a lot of the industry started later, and there's less companies that do it. And so here in the Midwest, I'm willing to bet, and actually know this. I know this for sure. Big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, maybe some little blue stem, and some other species. Just those grasses are about 10% more expensive than a quote-unquote cheap mix that adds forbs. Like those same species plus black-eyed Susan, purple prairie clover, white prairie clover, Illinois bundleflower, Maximilian sunflower, partridge pea. Yep, there's a couple others that here in the Midwest where actually they're produced in such great number. It's almost marginal. It's not quite. It probably is about a 10% increase, but it's not much. And I'm curious, what are some of those forbs? Because those that matters greatly. If you say, "Yep, you need Canada anemone in there," well, then you just tripled your price on the mix. That's that's different. But I'm curious what species.
Yeah, the ones, and I'm going off memory here. I hadn't looked at that recently, so I may miss a few. But and this is in no particular order of importance. But lance leaf, black-eyed Susan. Now, both of those start early, start fast, and start big, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And lance leaf's not a warm season per se, but nevertheless, it's a great pollinator plant, and cattle eat it, and it works. Black-eyed Susan. Now, black-eyed Susan plays out after a few years, and if you prescribe burning your pasture, what we saw is that really gives it a shot in the shorts and brings it back into play.
Oh,
purple prairie clover. Not purple prairie clover, but purple coneflower is proved to be very good for it. Upright prairie coneflower is another real good choice. Oxeye is a very good choice. In terms of legumes, we like partridge pea, but in a pasture setting, at least in our experience, hasn't done a real good job of reseeding, being an annual, even though as a rule it's a very good reseeder.
Yeah.
But I like partridge pea. I would still include it in there. I mentioned Illinois bundleflower. Again, in our environment, we haven't had real good success in getting it established. The prairie clovers, purple and white, same thing. We keep throwing the seed out there and keep not seeing anything. And maybe one day, maybe it's hard seed, it'll pop up, but we're just not seeing it. But the legume that we really, really are falling in love with, and cattle are nuts about, is your help me, y'all.
cup plant.
Desmodiums.
Tick trefoils.
Yeah.
And so they do well in a pasture, that they're not a problem. Cattle eat the stew out of them, and of course wildlife. You know, a quail. That's a steak dinner for a quail. So I really like to see the desmodiums.
But
And
the
so if
people
I was
hate
going to
tick
create a
trefoil
mix,
because of the the Velcro.
It's,
Yeah.
yeah, it sticks.
well, if you're a bird hunter though, you're happy to have that on your britches. It means something good.
Yeah,
But you know,
that's-
those are now we have put cup plant and Maximilian, and it takes a couple years for them to really express themselves in those pasture settings. Cattle definitely eat them. I like them. I'd like to have them out there. They're from a standpoint of contributing tonnage to the stand. Obviously, they're really strong, but they have a propensity that if your stocking isn't such that cattle catch them kind of early and hit them pretty good, they're going to get big and woolly. And again, I'm just speaking for the cattlemen I know in the South, lower Midwest. Is you know if some of those things get big and ugly, and they be stressing out over them, right? But again, a good manager, I think you could have both out there. I think they would play a role. And I keep mentioning the management, so let me. Well, I don't know. Maybe we need to talk about something else, but let me talk a little bit about the management with forbs. So
Yeah.
for native grasses, the foliation is really, really important. I've mentioned that. We can't constantly keep them too short, too few leaves. And on the other hand, if we let them get away from us, they can get pretty woolly and stemmy and lower digestibility, and so everybody worries about overgrazing with native grass pastures. So here's heretical point number 2 for the morning. I think undergrazing is a bigger problem than overgrazing. And why do I say that? Well, because what we see with undergrazing, and this is true in a fescue pasture as it is in a native grass pasture, but what cattle are going to do, if they got a lot more forage than they need, in other words, it's understocked, what they're going to do is they're going to go after the things they prefer, number one, and then because they're eating parts of the pasture, other parts of the pasture are going to mature and get away from them, right? So if I have an understocked pasture that has Maximilian in it, and they don't get around to that corner of the pasture, there's going to be 12-foot tall Maximilian out there. And once they've started this pattern, cattle always want younger vegetation because it always has higher digestibility and higher protein. So what they're going to do is they're going to go in there and they're going to return to the same patches within that pasture that they grazed previously, because when they grazed it, they set it back, and they're just going to be on a rotation. What may only be 30% of the pasture, wearing out those spots and basically killing that grass. And what they end up doing is, my terminology for it is, they're eating a hole in the pasture, right? And once those perennials are weakened enough, they may not blink out, but they're opening the door for every manner of competition. And Kent, you brought up earlier brome. If you want to find a brome patch up at y'all's latitude in a native pasture, it's probably going to be where you had very poor establishment success, probably because of a patch of weeds in that part of the pasture, or just as likely is because it was what we might call a grazing camp, right? So the animals just focused on that and wore out the natives. And so if you want to have good performance from your forbs, you want relatively heavy stocking. And I mentioned earlier that you can leave animals in there all summer long. I don't recommend that normally, because you'd have to have your stocking pretty accurate to make that work. So I really normally recommend rotational grazing anyway, right? And so that good rotational grazing, where you're never letting that canopy get below about 15, 16 inches and never taller than about 30 inches, again, take half, leave half, is a really good system. And if you have enough grazing pressure to take that down, it's going to keep some of those woollier forbs from getting away from you, and you get good utilization of the forbs. And the neat thing, and one of the things we wanted to see, is we get plenty of blooms still out there, even in the presence of cattle. Now, if we have really heavy stocking and they're just really knocking everything down, then very few of those forbs get to successfully flower and produce seed. But if we're kind of in that intermediate range that I've been talking about, I can have blooms all through that pasture, cattle all through that pasture, and grassland birds all through that pasture. So somewhere, and I always use this analogy, you're driving down the road, and I know some of those little section gravel roads y'all got up there.
Yep.
There's a ditch on the right side of the road that you don't want to go into on a snowy day. But you know
Yes.
what? The ditch that's on the other side of the road, you don't want to go into it either, right? So
Yep.
Yeah.
the old joke, keeping it between the ditches, I mean, that's what we're talking about. Not too heavy, not too light. And so managing forbs in a pasture setting, you don't need to do anything heroic to keep the forbs around other than not overgrazing it. And to kind of keep them from taking over, you need to not undergraze it. So
Yeah.
kind of in the middle is where you're going to get the most consistent performance and long-term viability of that entire plant community.
That is
Yeah,
incredible.
that's great advice. I have a species specific question here for you while we were kind of on that. One of the things Nicholas pointed out to me one time when we were driving down the road doing traveling between podcasts, he's like, "Man, have you noticed in all these pastures, like just how much hoary vervain there is? It just seems like the cows are avoiding it. You know, like they're everything else is grazed around it, but you'll see all these patches of hoary vervain." First of all, is Nicholas's observation scientifically correct? And if so, what is it about hoary vervain that just seems to not be palatable to grazers?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular species. I'm familiar with vervains more generally, and so I don't know that I've seen it in a pasture setting. And it also might be a lot more prevalent at y'all's latitude than it is here. But there are species like that cattle just avoid. And you know, when we get into the palatability question, a lot of times that's kind of hard to put our finger on. We don't really know why cattle will eat this and not eat that. There's a species here, and I don't know how common it is up y'all's way, but prickly lettuce.
Yes.
And yeah, so you feel the underside of the leaf has got that little
Yep.
row of thorns is
It's
way
almost
too
like a
strong.
thistle. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like a
Well,
thistle.
cattle, first thing they'll do if they find that prickly lettuce in a pasture is go eat it. And you think, well,
Really?
that doesn't make sense. So, yeah. So why there is this, you know, for instance, big blue stem, they will eat it preferentially to just about any other warm season grass I know, with one obvious exception. And the question is why? You know, we really don't know in terms of, you know, chemical constituents or, you know, will they taste, or we've even speculated some. Well, maybe it's a mouth feel, right? I mean, you get, you know, kind of a rough leaf, and you know, maybe they avoid that. But again, cattle eat some rough things at times. You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
there's
like
people who have meat
putting
resistance.
potato chips. It's like putting potato chips on your sandwich. It's all about texture sometimes.
There you go. So we really don't understand. At least I don't understand. There may be some researchers somewhere or others that feel like they've solved that puzzle. But my feeling is that there's very real preference, but we can't always explain it.
Yeah.
And
Man.
so, you know, I mentioned increasers and decreasers, and Nicholas, the vervain sounds to me like it's sure enough an increaser, right? It's something they avoid,
Yeah.
and they'll eat everything else but it.
Well, my understanding of
Yeah.
vervain, you see it a lot on the side of roads, is that it is really good. It doesn't like competition, but it can grow out of a rock. So if you've got a bunch
Yeah,
of
it
big blue
loves
stem around it, it
disturbance.
won't compete it out. But yeah, if you have disturbance and the big blue stem's taken out, it'll persevere. Okay, so Dr. Kaiser, we've got you about 20 more minutes.
Real quick,
And
I got one more key question here, Nicholas. While we're talking about some of this, a
Okay.
concern, of course, for cattlemen is bloating, and a lot of the species we mentioned,
yeah.
especially those plateau compatible species,
They tend to be
are
legumes.
legumes, right? And is there a fear of when introducing forbs, specifically legumes, to a pasture mix? Is there a concern of bloating?
Simply no. These species, I've never seen any documentation that said that that's an issue. And again, a lot of these sunflowers, for instance, don't have that problem. And the legumes we put in, the desmodiums and the partridge peas, don't produce enough volume of forage on the one hand. You know, from a forage mass standpoint, this is true in native prairies all across the Great Plains and the Southeast, is, you know, some of the research there at Konza Prairie with K-State, our native grasslands were typically 90% biomass was, or north of that, was C4 grasses, our warm season grasses. Forbs, even though they might make up a large number of the individual plants out there, never make up a large proportion of the biomass. And so the kind of problem we run into with some of our clovers where they become very abundant, you have that kind of spring where there's
Yeah.
just a big flush of that clover, that can be an issue, but not with these native species.
Yeah,
Would
that's good to
would
know.
you
I've
ever
always wondered on
add
that.
would you ever add medium red clover to warm season grasses? If you say, "Hey, I'm not going to do the other forbs. I want to guarantee its ability, its success in the field." Would you ever do that?
In short, yes, but with a little asterisk next to it. So we did a study a few years ago where we did exactly that. Is we on purpose introduced red clover, and in that study we want to make sure we had red clover. So for 4 years running, every March we went out there and or maybe it was February in our world, dropped the drill in the ground and put another 4, 5, 6 pounds. I can't remember our seeding rate offhand. Let's just call it 5 pounds of medium red clover in there, right? And clover, and I'm sure you all see the same thing up there. It kind of can, you can have what I'll call a clover spring, where just boom, there's clover everywhere, and you have years where you don't see a lot of clover. And I think it has a lot to do with, how temperature and moisture come together that spring. But red clover can be compatible with these natives, but keep in mind that it's going to break dormancy well in front, again, 4 to 6 weeks in front of the natives. And if you have one of those clover springs, and during our study we saw one of these, where that field looked like 100% stand of red clover 2 feet tall, and not a sprig of native grass to be seen. And we got, it's not statistically valid to say this, but we saw really good gain coming off that paddock that year, and heavy clover. But it really slowed down the growth of the warm season perennial. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, mixing cool seasons and warm seasons. If you get the right spring for those cool seasons, so Kentucky bluegrass has been mentioned. It's not a native species, but it's an annual, or there's an annual bluegrass. But that in either way, where you have heavy grazing in a native grass pasture, those bluegrasses will come on and in the spring can completely overtop the canopy. One of the reasons that folks figured out to burn native grass pastures years ago is it removes that blanket that keeps the native warm seasons asleep for an extra week or 2 or 3 or 4 in the spring, right? That's what you're doing. So red clover can have that exact same effect in the spring depending on the year. The other funny thing we noticed is that when we
great point.
compared it to a standard fertilizer rate of 60 units per acre of N, there was no advantage to having the red clover out there. Iowa State did a study years ago. I wish I could call the name of the fellow that I want to say it was Ken somebody. He's retired now, and I think he may even passed away. But he did a lot of neat research on switchgrass. And they saw the same thing. When you put a cool season legume with a warm season perennial, depending on how good your establishment of the legume is, depending on the spring, the winter, it can be a real competitive drag. So my point is this, is that red clover can fit, but you have to be watching it to make sure it doesn't kick your butt and become a competitive drag on your warm season. But it can
What do you
get
do
you
if
some
it
free
does?
nitrogen. It's great for it. Yeah, so the problem is if it does, one idea would be to go in there and graze it off, but you asked about bloat earlier. Well, if you've got enough that makes you concerned about it and you want to graze it off, then you may have a bloat problem. But you could still use grazing depending on the scale of your pasture and, just do some limit grazing, so to speak, where you turn them in there for a couple hours, let them hammer it some, or throw some dry hay in with them, to help balance that out. So some of the things you would normally do to try to check bloat. But so the problem is red clover could add something, and the other thing that we noticed is, our rates of gain on native grasses in the first 6 to 8 weeks of the spring grazing season are gaudy, right? They're crowding 3 pounds a day. It's almost like feeding them silage. And at that time of year, clovers aren't necessarily going to add that much because of that already high rate of gain. And as the summer goes on, red clover tends to become less competitive because of the heat and the maybe drier weather. And so the native grass animal performance also starts to drop off. And so where maybe you could benefit from having a legume, is a time of year when the red clover is really not there to help you. So it helps you when you don't really need to help, and it's not around when you do need to help, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not a huge advocate of putting it in there, but it can work. One thing we haven't talked about is eastern gamma grass, which can be very clumpy stands. And
Mm-hmm.
I would, and it breaks dormancy earlier than all the other natives. And so if I was growing eastern gamma grass, I wouldn't hesitate to put red clover in there. Switchgrass, a little more aggressive, a little earlier dormancy breaking. So in switchgrass, I'd be a little less concerned about having red clover. But blue stems, Indian grass, later dormancy break, a little more sensitive to competition. So kind of a nuanced answer, but yes, you
Yeah.
can do it, but look at the conditions in which you're going to do it.
I love
Yeah.
it. I love it.
Yeah.
It's a realistic view on farming, and every farm, even 2 miles apart, can be totally different. I do have one more technical question, and I want to
You bet.
get to a big picture question because I think you've got great views on that. But I'm totally ignorant on this, and I've had this question a bunch. How do you know, specifically with warm season grasses, when your cattle or your grazers are over it? Now, I know that it's going to go different months in different parts of the country, but is there a part of the plant or a stage of the plant where you can safely say, like, yeah, grazers are probably done with this about now?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier, leaf surface area. So what we've seen in some of our studies, we do something that you don't do on the farm, but we do it in science because it's a great idea in science and a bad idea on the farm, but it's called put and take grazing. And so if you ever see these growth curves for grasses, one of the ways we can establish those is with put and take grazing, right? And so what we do is we know the canopy that we're trying to maintain in that pasture, right? So I've used some figures with y'all. Let's say I'm trying to maintain an 18-inch canopy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is once a week, I go grab some more steers from my research herd and I pump them in there if that canopy's starting to float up above there. Or if I'm noticing there's a downward trend in that canopy, I pull them out. And so what I can do is on a weekly basis, I can document my carrying capacity all through the grazing season. And
Wow.
when we have done that, what we tend to do by the latter part of the grazing season on into August is that pasture looks pretty ratty at that point. Because even though we've tried to maintain a consistent canopy, reality overtakes us, right? And so we get kind of irregular and tends to be kind of stemmy, depending on the species. And so I mentioned those 3 pounds a day gain rates that we see, or nearly 3 pounds, 2.8, 2.9, that we see early in the season in that put and take grazing environment, which is where that data comes from I just mentioned. By the time we get into August, we're down below a pound per day. 0.8 is what we were getting.
Wow.
So you're really not doing much in terms of animal performance in August. But I will tell you this: if you're using that kind of season-long grazing approach, but at that point in the year, and I'm going to use fescue as a framework because that's our part of the world. If I were to go out onto fescue or Bermuda grass in August, I'm not even going to do 0.8, right?
Wow.
And in the case of fescue, if I'm setting it up for a fall stockpile or I'm just trying to rest it because it's already stressed by drought or heat, I don't really need to be on it. And so really, as bad as 0.8 sounds, it may be the best date in town. And the grass can still withstand it. You're not hurting the grass. So the real answer to that, Nicholas, would be when the grass doesn't have enough leaf surface area, which if it's real uniformly grazed, it's too short. But use your eyeball, right? You can have 4 foot tall switchgrass where there's a stem because of how you've grazed it that they're refusing, but they've stripped most of the leaves off it because that's what they'll start to do if it's too
Yeah.
mature. Is that they'll start stripping leaves. So,
Interesting.
but I will say, and again, management, right? Canopy. So we also did a study where we grazed fairly aggressively early in the year and then lightened up the stocking for the second half of the summer. So a real simple adjustment. And we actually saw rates of gain in that second half of the summer because we had hit it kind of hard, kept it vegetative, then we lightened up the stocking. We've seen this by accident, but this was also by design in this particular case. And we see that grass start to come back real strong. And during July and August in that particular study, we were still getting rates of gain of 1.8 pounds a day, which again, and that's why I'm an advocate of rotational grazing, is I can set up a pasture to be great forage in August and even September by when I glass grazed it and was able to keep it vegetative and how much rest I've given it since then. So if I know I want to have some good forage in August, it's real simple. Graze it really hard in late June, early July, and then give it about 3 or 4 weeks of rest, and then you can have very good forage in August. So again, I would look at the plant, and I would look at my overall management system of what's my alternative at that point. And bottom line to me, Nicholas, is let's not hurt the perennial. So if you're sitting the threshold where leaf surface area has kind of disappeared, let's back away from it.
Man, that's incredible. That's incredible advice, and I will be documenting this podcast because I get a lot of questions on native grassland pasture, and I just only know what people tell me, and now they're all going to know what you tell them. I'm going to send this to a bunch of people,
Right.
So I've been really grateful. But you've obviously got a big brain. You've used it to study things, but you've also used it to speak into the big picture of how we do agriculture and how our, as you described it, our working land can work for more than just economic productivity, but we can actually check a lot of boxes together. I'm curious, as you're painting a picture of the future, let's pretend that for whatever reason you get to be dictator of the United States and you get to start changing how agriculture, farming, and pasture and grazing happens. What kind of things are you changing? What are some big picture things you'd like to see different?
Well, I guess one thing I would like to see is, and I'm going to just mostly speak to pasture and range rather than the row crop systems, but one thing I would like to see is a increased reliance on native species, right? I'd like to see, because the underlying thing that drives me, Nicholas, is the principle of stewardship, right? And so, we live in an amazing world that even the smartest of us, the most studied of us, really, if we're really honest about it, only understand through a glass dimly, as the good book says, right? We just got this fingernail hanging on, understanding what's going on. A lot of people are talking about soil health these days and focusing on the soil biology. With all due respect to the people that study that, I think we're like 4-year-olds at this point in terms of our understanding of those systems. We get some general ideas. There's a lot we don't understand. Anyway, so to my way of thinking, I would love to see a big increase in the reliance on native species in forage systems, because I think it gives us broader stewardship of this incredible creation that we've been given to take care of, right? And, in terms of water quality, in terms of soil health, organic matter, resilience to droughts. And the other side of it, and I guess I've always kind of been a believer in the canary in the coal mine theory. And I realize that a species called a grasshopper sparrow, we don't hunt it, and most people don't even know what the heck it is. And even if they saw it, they probably still wouldn't know what it was. But I kind of feel like we need to keep those pieces parts of the system, right? And I think when a lot of these species are disappearing on us, it's telling us something, right?
Yeah.
And so, we grow the heck out of wheat in this country. We grow the heck out of soybeans. Neither one of them native, right? I mean, there's millions and millions of acres of those. They're not native to North America. But I've always kind of gone back to our grasslands and said, well, wait a minute. The good Lord planted blue stem, for example, here. Maybe it's a good tool for us. Another way to look at it, too, is, if you're rowing a boat, which not too many people do anymore. When I was a kid, we had rowboats. But, you go to row across the pond, you got 2 oars. And so in the world of forages, we got a warm season grass and we got a cool season grass, right? We can divide the world up that easily. Why not use both oars? Why are you trying to ask a cool season grass to do what a warm season grass was designed to do, or vice versa? So, to me, I think that would be a great step forward in stewardship. And along those lines, our management of our grasslands, I've emphasized how important it is to the outcomes we get in our native pastures. That's just as true for our introduced grass species. So I think, good stewardship through grazing and a bigger reliance on natives would go a long way toward improving things. So, that's something I would love to see happen.
Man, I love that. I that's what I've been. I mean, that's why we're here today. Is I think there's been really cool things with CRP, and I don't mean to dog on CRP, but we're getting close to max. The farmers who want to be in it are in it, and yeah, there will be some variance of 1,000,000 acres or two across the Midwest over the next while, but where I see there could be a much bigger difference in natives is the pasture and the hunting, and I think both really care. Yeah, and
Well, and along those lines, you could take a piece of ground wherever you are, and you could get yourself a 300 species mix if that makes you happy, and you can do all the right things to try and get native plants back in there. You'd be very particular to this plant actually native to Iowa. Maybe it was native to Missouri. We're not going to pay attention. You know how Missouri is, right? Just kidding, y'all Missourians. But the point is, you could you could get the species mix just as fine as you want. But at the end of the day, a grassland in North America is a system where there is fire and there is grazing. That's what kept grasslands grasslands. I can take you out to central Kansas and show you a forest because they haven't been burning and they haven't been grazing, right?
yeah,
And so even well into the plains, woody invasion can be a huge issue. High plains maybe not so
Right.
much, but daggone in the central and eastern plains, absolutely. And so to me, if you look at the total ecology of this system, the thing I got against CRP, and I'm like you, I'm not hating on it, but I'm just saying is it's missing the disturbances that make it a viable ecosystem. So I go so far as to say is that grasslands without either fire or grazing aren't really grasslands. They're a garden.
yeah,
And so if you really want a healthy, functional grassland, sure, bison are great, but we're not going to repopulate the Great Plains with bison. But we can repopulate some of these grasslands with Herefords and Angus and Charolais and Simmental and your breed of choice. So I think what we have found when we've looked at the wildlife side of this and grassland birds, without grazing, when you just got 6 foot, 10 foot tall native grasses, real dense, forbs or not, that's great blackbird habitat. Red-winged blackbirds love that. That's about it. If you put the cattle in there and you create the disturbance, I can take you to switchgrass pastures that are slam full of grassland birds and insects and all kinds of life because they got the cattle there. And so
Wow.
I'm a huge advocate that if you really want the highest and best in terms of native plant communities, give me a freaking cow. And I
Yeah.
will get you the best, the logical package that is out there. And so not only do we have tens of millions of acres of pasture in this country that could be converted in part to natives, but they have the advantage of having a cow nearby. And a lot of folks in the conservation world don't want to hear about that cow, but the reality is it is the best tool we have to approximate a buffalo and create the natural disturbance that belongs in North American grasslands.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm a big believer in the whole working lands concept, is I think it's actually much better than just planting it and smiling at it.
I have no sway in the government, but I know people that listen to this do. I would love,
Yeah.
and lots of other people would love to see cattle introduced to our CRP. It's a win-win
No,
for
absolutely.
everybody.
Absolutely. Yep.
So
I think
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
probably the scary thing there is just, will it be controlled enough? Will it be, or
Right.
will the cows just sit there in the CRP? Because then it starts to become a negative thing at that point.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think along with very careful guidelines on what has to be done. How often the cattle have to be rotated and
Yeah.
an appropriate stick to go with the carrot if those guidelines aren't followed. Then I think that it would be I think it'd be a great thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. Well, Dr. Kaiser, before we take off, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just appreciate the opportunity and glad to see y'all's interest and passion in this. And I think, what we're doing is something that can benefit a farmer, benefit a bird hunter, benefit a deer hunter, benefit some of these creatures that we don't even know what they are, benefit our soil.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of these things where, I hate to say it, but I feel like everybody can win if it's done properly and appropriately. And we're not looking for bad guys or good guys. We're just looking to try and do a better job of stewardship.
I love it. I absolutely love it. If they love what they're hearing from you, where can they find more of you or your colleagues that are doing the research?
Yeah, there's our web page that I would encourage, and probably is the best sort of central warehouse for all sorts of things. And there's a book here that we put out, and if somebody really wants to dive deep into this, I don't know if this is going to work, but
Yeah.
I don't know, is that backwards?
No, it
But
looks
that's a
great.
book that's on there.
What's the
It-
title on it? Can you say the title?
Native grass forages for the eastern United States.
Okay, native
And,
grass forages
this-
for the eastern United
Yeah,
States.
this is for somebody who really wants to dig in deep, but it's tragically 430 pages. So there's a lot of information in there, and but that web page, there's videos on there, something we call our Native
What-
Grass College.
What's the web page?
Yeah, so it's if you just type in Center for Native Grasslands or Native Grasses at utk.edu.
And there'll be a
Center
link
for-
under the podcast, everyone listening. We'll have a link for
Center
you.
for Native Grasses is what it's called.
Or Native Grasslands.
Grasslands. Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
Um,
there'll be a link in the show notes.
yeah.
I love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that this is exactly what I've been looking for a while. We've talked to other people who are experts in grazing, but never a professor, someone who studied it, academically, and I'm just having the time of my life. I'm sorry, everyone listening, if the connectivity issues caused a problem with your being able to listen.
I wish this was a in-person conversation.
Yeah, Dr.
Nick and
Kaiser,
I
we're gonna have
both
to
had-
swing on out. I'm in Tennessee about every other year, just because Lee
Okay.
University. Are you familiar with Lee University?
Yeah. Yeah,
Half
you
my
bet.
family went there, and
Oh,
got some
cool.
in-laws and
Cool.
stuff out there. So, but
It's right down the road.
yeah. Well, where are you guys at? University of Tennessee.
UT is here in Knoxville.
Okay, so I live in Knoxville, Iowa, but you live in Knoxville,
Oh, isn't that
Tennessee.
something?
Yeah,
There you go.
a little bigger.
There you go. All right.
But man, all right. Well, thanks so much, everyone who is listening. I highly recommend sending this to someone who has pasture, if you can do it without, sounding precocious and hey, you need to listen to these guys. But if you know someone who's got pasture, they're open to new ideas. I mean, apparently open to ideas that would put more pounds on their cows, or native grazing. Otherwise, something that really helps spread the conservation word, I've said it before, is writing a review. If this is your first time here and you love what you're hearing, just give us a little 5-star, write a little thing. We don't get paid more from that. Dr. Kaiser doesn't get paid more from that. No one here gets paid more for that. Here's what happens with that. Apple or Spotify or wherever you're listening to this, they say, oh, this person likes this. We'll put this podcast in front of other people who like this. And the idea is that the conservation message gets put in front of more people. And that's what we're here for. Because just like Dr. Kaiser, conservation happens one mind at a time.